Picture this: a lavish seafood feast from your favorite pirate movie, complete with roasted chicken, fresh fruit, and tankards of ale. The camera pans across tables, groaning under the weight of succulent meats, tropical fruits glistening in the candlelight, and pirates laughing as they tear into perfectly cooked lobster. Now snap back to reality and imagine a weathered sailor desperately trying to chew through a piece of hardtack, so hard it could double as a weapon, his face contorting with disgust as he forces down each painful bite, washing it down with water so contaminated it is barely drinkable and tastes like it was filtered through a rotting corpse. This stark contrast between Hollywood fantasy and historical reality forms the backbone of one of the most brutal aspects of pirate life, their diet. When most people think of pirates, their minds conjure images of swashbuckling adventures, buried treasure chests overflowing with gold doubloons, and endless freedom on the crystalline waters of the Caribbean. The reality, however, tells a far darker story, one of survival against decay, disease, and starvation that makes modern prison food look like fine dining. The pirate diet wasn't a choice made from preference or cultural tradition. It was a desperate necessity dictated by the harsh realities of life at sea, where food preservation meant the literal difference between life and an agonizing death from starvation or disease. These men lived in a world without refrigeration, without understanding of bacteria or vitamins, and without the luxury of regular resupply from friendly ports. Every meal was a gamble with their health, every bite a potential encounter with death. Today, we're diving deep into the gritty, unvarnished reality of pirate cuisine, exploring the three foundational pillars that kept these maritime criminals breathing, the invisible enemies that stalked them in the form of nutritional diseases, and the desperate, often violent measures they took to supplement their meager rations. By the end of this journey through history's most unappetizing chapter, you'll understand why the romantic image of pirate feasts is one of history's greatest myths, and why these men would often risk everything, their lives, their freedom, their very souls, just for the chance at a single fresh meal. The foundation of any pirate's diet rested on three essential elements, chosen not for their palatability, nutritional value, or even their ability to sustain human health, but solely for their capacity to survive months at sea without completely decomposing into inedible sludge. These weren't gourmet choices made by discerning palates. They were survival foods designed with one purpose: to keep a crew alive long enough to reach the next port, capture the next prize, or find the next source of sustenance. Understanding these three pillars requires us to step into the salt-stained boots of a pirate and see the world through eyes that had witnessed shipmates die from hunger, watched grown men weep over a moldy piece of bread, and experienced the gnawing desperation that comes from knowing your next meal might be weeks away. This was unjust about food. It was about the fundamental human struggle for survival in one of history's most unforgiving environments. The first and most infamous of these dietary pillars was hardtack, a simple yet notorious biscuit that would become synonymous with maritime suffering and the closest thing to edible concrete ever created by human hands. To call hardtack a biscuit in the modern sense would be laughable. These weren't the fluffy, buttery delights we might enjoy with afternoon tea. Instead, hardtack was essentially a weapon disguised as food, a mixture of flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until it achieved the consistency and durability of limestone. The recipe for hardtack was brutally simple, because it had to be. Flour and water were mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, cut into squares roughly 4 inches on each side, and then baked in ovens until every trace of moisture had been driven out. No fat, no eggs, no milk, no sugar, nothing that might provide flavor or nutrition, but also nothing that might cause the biscuits to spoil during long months at sea. The goal wasn't to create something delicious. It was to create something that could theoretically last for decades without rotting. A properly made piece of hardtack could survive for years if kept reasonably dry, making it the perfect long-term food storage solution for ships that might spend months crossing oceans without the opportunity to resupply. Ship's biscuits found in sunken vessels have been recovered centuries later, still technically edible, though whether anyone would actually want to eat them is another matter entirely. But calling hardtack food was being generous to the point of charity. These biscuits were so phenomenally hard that sailors often could bite through them when they were fresh from the oven, let alone after months of storage in damp ships' holds. The standard technique for consuming hardtack involved soaking it in whatever liquid was available. Water, if they were lucky, rum, if they weren't, or even coffee, if they happened to encounter such luxuries. The soaking process could take hours, and even then, the resulting paste was often described as having the consistency and appeal of wet cardboard mixed with sawdust. Many sailors developed elaborate rituals around hardtack consumption. They would pound it with hammers, pistol butts, or any other hard object available, breaking it into manageable chunks that could be swallowed without risk of breaking teeth. This gave hardtack one of its many colorful nicknames, tooth dullers. Other names included ships, tiles, sea biscuit, and the particularly evocative jawbreakers, each name reflecting a different aspect of the hardtack experience. Experienced sailors learned to identify different grades of hardtack by sound. Fresh hardtack, if such a thing existed, would produce a sharp crack when struck. Older hardtack might sound more like a dull thud, indicating that moisture had begun to penetrate the biscuit. The worst sound of all was no sound at all, accompanied by the feeling of the hammer sinking into the biscuit, a sure sign that the hardtack had become infested with insects and their larvae. The real horror of hardtack, however, revealed itself when the biscuits got wet or were stored improperly. Moisture was hardtack's greatest enemy, but also sometimes its only salvation. When water penetrated the iron-hard exterior, it didn't just soften the biscuit. It created perfect breeding conditions for weevils, beetles, maggots, and a host of other creatures that found hardtack's simple carbohydrates irresistible. These infested biscuits earned charming nicknames like worm castles, maggot bread, and moving biscuits, the latter because you could literally see them squirm when held up to the light. Experienced sailors developed a complex relationship with these unwelcome protein supplements. Some would tap their hardtack against the table before eating, listening for the telltale sounds of insects moving inside. Others would hold their biscuits up to candlelight or sunlight, shaking out as many visible creatures as possible before attempting to consume what remained. The more pragmatic sailors learned to eat their hardtack in complete darkness, reasoning that what they couldn't see couldn't disgust them. This led to the grim sailor's joke that hardtack was always better by moonlight. Not because it looked more appetizing, but because you couldn't see what you were eating. Some sailors even convinced themselves that the insects added necessary protein to their diet, though whether this was genuine belief or psychological self-defense remains unclear. The psychological impact of eating infested hardtack cannot be overstated. Imagine being hungry enough that you would willingly consume bread crawling with maggots, knowing full well what you were doing, and being grateful for the opportunity. This was desperation born of a single crisis. This was the daily reality for men who might spend years of their lives at sea, subsisting on provisions that would make modern prisoners riot. Despite its utterly unappetizing nature, Hardtack served several crucial purposes that kept it at the center of maritime nutrition. It provided the carbohydrates and calories that sailors needed to fuel their demanding physical labor. A typical daily ration might include a full pound of hardtack per person, which could provide roughly 1,500 calories. Not enough for optimal health, but sufficient to prevent immediate starvation. For men engaged in the back-breaking labor of sailing, fighting, and maintaining a ship, this represented roughly half their daily caloric needs. The preparation and consumption of hardtack became a defining ritual aboard pirate ships, one that shaped social relationships and crew dynamics in unexpected ways. Meal times would see sailors gathering around with their improvised tools, hammers, knife handles, belaying pins, or anything else that could crack through the Biscuit's armor-like exterior. These gatherings became opportunities for storytelling, complaint sharing, and the kind of gallows humor that helped men cope with their circumstances. Some crews developed surprisingly sophisticated techniques for making hardtack marginally more palatable. Enterprising cooks might fry crumbled hardtack in whatever fat they could obtain, creating a dish known as skilly-gali. That was considered a luxury despite being essentially fried sawdust. Others would mix hardtack crumbs with molasses when available, creating a sweet paste that masked some of the biscuit's inherent awfulness. The lucky few crews that included someone with actual cooking knowledge might transform hardtack into something approaching real food. Hardtack could be ground into flour and used to make dumplings for stew, mixed with any available meat to create primitive meatballs, or even fermented with captured beer or wine to create a sort of alcoholic porridge. These innovations required both skill and luck, skill to execute the techniques properly, and luck to have access to the additional ingredients needed to transform hardtack into something resembling actual cuisine. The social dynamics around hardtack distribution were complex and often fraught with tension. Pirate crews operating under democratic principles would typically distribute hardtack equally among all crew members, regardless of rank or position. However, the quality of hardtack could vary dramatically, and disputes over who received the least infested or most recently acquired biscuits could lead to serious conflicts. Some crews developed elaborate systems for fairly distributing food, including rotating who got first choice or drawing lots for different portions. The second pillar of the pirate diet was salt meat, primarily salt pork or salt beef, preserved in massive wooden barrels filled with brine so concentrated it could preserve a corpse indefinitely. This preservation method represented one of humanity's earliest attempts at long-term food storage. Developed out of absolute necessity, but executed with techniques that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. The process of creating salt meat was itself a brutal affair that revealed the desperation of maritime provisioning. Fresh beef or pork would be butchered and cut into chunks roughly the size of a man's fist, then packed in alternating layers with coarse salt in massive wooden barrels. The salt drew moisture from the meat while creating an environment hostile to most bacteria, effectively mummifying the flesh before it could rot. The barrels were then filled with brine water so saturated with salt that additional salt crystals would no longer dissolve. When fresh from the barrel, salt meat was merely tough, fibrous, and intensely salty, challenging to eat but recognizably food. However, as weeks turned to months at sea, this preserved protein underwent a transformation that defied both appetite and imagination. The constant motion of the ship, combined with temperature fluctuations and the gradual breakdown of the preservation process, turned salt meat into something that bore only a theoretical resemblance to its original form. After months at sea, salt meat took on the consistency of leather that had been soaked in seawater and left to dry in the sun. Sailors would often have to boil these pieces for hours, sometimes entire afternoons, just to make them soft enough to cut with a knife, let alone chew. Even after extended boiling, the meat retained a texture that sailors compared to rope, tree bark, or, in particularly colorful descriptions, leather seasoned with sea salt and despair. The salt content of these preserved meats was truly staggering, sometimes comprising up to 25% of the meat's total weight. This created a vicious cycle of thirst and dehydration that plagued sailors constantly. A single serving of salt meat could contain more sodium than modern nutritionists recommend for an entire week, causing immediate and intense thirst that was often impossible to satisfy with the limited fresh water available on ship. The high sodium content also triggered a cascade of health problems that sailors of the era didn't understand but suffered from nonetheless. Kidney problems, high blood pressure, and fluid retention were common among long-term sailors, conditions that were likely exacerbated by their sodium-heavy diet. Some sailors would develop a condition they called salt madness, characterized by confusion, hallucinations, and violent behavior, symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as severe electrolyte imbalance. One of the most disturbing aspects of salt meat consumption was the mystery meat phenomenon that sailors grimly referred to as salt horse. After months or years in barrels, meat became so transformed by the preservation process that identifying its origin became nearly impossible. The combination of salt curing, aging, and the natural breakdown of tissue meant that beef, pork, and sometimes questionable alternatives became indistinguishable from one another. Stories circulated among sailors about unscrupulous suppliers who would mix cheaper cuts of meat, organ meat, or even more questionable protein sources into the barrels. Some pieces of salt horse were so thoroughly transformed that they bore no resemblance to any recognizable cut of meat, leading to speculation about what exactly sailors were consuming. The meat would become so hardened and preserved that some pieces were literally carved into practical items, patterns, decorative objects, or even tools, rather than consumed as food. The barrels themselves presented another layer of challenges and horrors. These massive wooden containers were intended to be waterproof, but months at sea took their toll on even the best-made barrels. The wooden staves would shift and separate, allowing seawater to mix with the already concentrated brine, making the contents even saltier and introducing new forms of contamination. As voyages progressed, the brine in meat barrels would develop colors and consistencies that defied description and challenged the strongest stomachs. The liquid would become thick, slimy, and often took on hues ranging from deep amber to disturbing greens and blacks. The smell emanating from opened meat barrels was legendary among sailors, a combination of salt, decay, and something indefinably wrong that could clear a deck faster than a fire alarm. Insects and other creatures would somehow find their way into supposedly sealed barrels, adding their own contributions to the already challenging mix. Sailors would often find themselves fishing out various creatures, some dead, some very much alive. Before they could access their meat ration, the presence of maggots in salt meat was so common that it barely merited comment, though their concentration could sometimes reach levels that made even hardened sailors pause. The psychological challenge of eating salt meat extended far beyond its physical unpalatability. Sailors had to overcome not just the terrible taste and texture, but also the knowledge of what they were consuming and the circumstances that had brought them to this point. Many wrote in their journals about the mental preparation required before each meal, the internal negotiations they had to conduct to force themselves to consume their rations. Some sailors would refuse to eat salt meat until they were literally starving, preferring to subsist on hardtack and whatever else they could find rather than face another meal of leather-tough, salt-encrusted protein. Others developed coping mechanisms, elaborate mental exercises that allowed them to dissociate from the eating process, treating consumption of salt meat as a purely mechanical necessity divorced from any concept of pleasure or satisfaction. Pirates developed numerous techniques for making salt meat more bearable, though bearable remained a relative term. Some would soak their meat portions in seawater for hours, reasoning that additional salt couldn't make things worse, while the water might soften the texture slightly. Others discovered that pounding salt meat with hammers or other tools could break down some of the tougher fibers, making it slightly easier to chew. The more resourceful crews learned to catch and save rainwater specifically for rinsing salt meat, a practice that could remove some of the surface salt while providing slightly fresher-tasting water for the rinsing process. However, this technique required not just rainfall but also containers for collecting water and time for the rinsing process, luxuries that weren't always available to crews operating under pressure. Some pirates became skilled at creating primitive stews by combining salt meat with any other available ingredients. Hardtack crumbs, captured vegetables, caught fish, or even seaweed could be combined with salt meat and boiled into something that resembled actual food. These stews were often more about psychological comfort than nutritional improvement, providing the illusion of variety and proper cooking that helped maintain crew morale. The third crucial element of the pirate diet wasn't food at all, but rather the liquid that sustained life itself. Or, in the case of pirates, the various alcoholic substitutes that replaced the fresh water they couldn't safely store or obtain. Fresh water was perhaps the most precious commodity on any pirate ship, more valuable than gold, silver, or jewels, because, without it, the most successful pirate crew would die within days, their treasure meaningless as they succumbed to dehydration under the merciless sun. The challenge of storing fresh water for extended periods at sea represented one of the most significant obstacles to maritime exploration and commerce. Water stored in wooden barrels, the only storage method available to pirates, would quickly become contaminated with bacteria, algae, and various microorganisms that turned life-sustaining liquid into a potentially deadly poison. The warm temperatures found in ships' holds created perfect breeding conditions for these contaminants, accelerating the water's transformation from clear and drinkable to green, slimy, and nauseating. Within just a few weeks at sea, ship's water would undergo a transformation that challenged even the strongest stomachs. The clear liquid would develop a green tinge that grew progressively darker and more opaque as various organisms multiplied in the warm, dark environment of the storage barrels. The smell would progress from merely stale to actively offensive, eventually reaching levels that could be detected from across the deck when barrels were opened. Sailors described the taste of contaminated ship's water in terms that ranged from poetic to profane. Some compared it to drinking from a stagnant pond filled with rotting vegetation, while others used more colorful language to describe flavors that seemed to combine the worst aspects of decay, salt, and something indefinably wrong. The texture could become thick and slimy, with visible particles floating in the liquid that no sailor wanted to examine too closely. The contamination wasn't just disgusting, it was potentially lethal. Waterborne illnesses could spread through a ship's crew with devastating speed, causing dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other diseases that could kill more pirates than any naval battle or storm. Crews that relied on contaminated water often found themselves weakened by illness, just when they needed to be at their strongest, whether facing enemy ships or navigating dangerous waters. Smart pirate captains learned early in their careers that pure, fresh water was a luxury they couldn't afford to rely on during extended voyages. This realization led to one of the most famous and misunderstood aspects of pirate culture, their legendary relationship with alcohol. Rum, beer, wine, and other alcoholic beverages weren't just recreational indulgences for pirates. They were essential survival tools that meant the difference between life and death on long voyages. Alcohol served multiple crucial functions that made it infinitely superior to water for maritime use. The high alcohol content in spirits like rum created an environment that was hostile to most bacteria and other microorganisms, essentially sterilizing the liquid and keeping it safe to drink for extended periods. Unlike water, properly stored alcohol could remain not just drinkable but actually pleasant to consume for months or even years at sea. The famous pirate drink known as grog emerged from this practical necessity rather than any desire for constant intoxication. Grog was typically a mixture of rum and water, with the proportions varying depending on supplies, circumstances, and crew preferences. The most common ratio was approximately 1 part rum to 3 or 4 parts water, though this could change dramatically based on availability of ingredients and the length of time since the crew had access to fresh supplies. This mixture served multiple essential purposes beyond simple hydration. The rum helped kill bacteria in the water portion of the mixture, making contaminated water safer to drink. The alcohol also helped mask the terrible taste of spoiled water, making the resulting beverage tolerable if not actually pleasant. Additionally, the rum provided calories and a psychological boost that helped maintain crew morale during the difficult periods between successful raids or port visits. Daily rum rations became one of the most important and closely watched aspects of pirate crew management. A typical pirate might expect to receive a pint of rum per day, usually divided into several smaller servings distributed throughout the day. This wasn't just about maintaining crew happiness, it was about maintaining crew health and preventing the diseases that could devastate an entire ship's company within days. The distribution of rum rations was often governed by the democratic articles that many pirate crews established, with specific provisions for how alcohol should be allocated, who was responsible for managing supplies, and what punishments awaited anyone caught stealing from the communal alcohol stores. These were uncasual guidelines, but serious legal documents that could determine whether a crew survived their next long voyage. Beer represented another important alternative to water, particularly among pirate crews that operated closer to European ports where beer was more readily available and culturally familiar. Beer offered several advantages over harder spirits. It was less potent, reducing the risk of the crew becoming too intoxicated to function effectively, while still providing the antibacterial properties needed to make it safe for long-term consumption. English pirates, in particular, showed a strong preference for beer when they could obtain it. Beer provided not just hydration, but also nutritional value in the form of carbohydrates from the grains used in brewing, vitamins from the yeast, and calories that helped supplement their otherwise inadequate diet. A good beer could provide as much nutrition as a meal, making it doubly valuable to crews struggling with limited food supplies. The brewing process itself created conditions that killed harmful bacteria while preserving beneficial nutrients, making beer one of the safest beverages available to sailors of any era. Some pirate crews even attempted to brew their own beer when circumstances allowed, using captured grain and improvised equipment to create fresh alcohol during extended voyages. Wine presented similar advantages to rum and beer, with the additional benefit that it could often be acquired through legitimate trade rather than outright piracy. Spanish and Portuguese wines were particularly prized by Caribbean pirates. As these beverages traveled well and actually improved in quality during long sea voyages, the wine trade in the Americas meant that merchant vessels often carried substantial quantities of wine, making them attractive targets for pirates seeking to improve their liquid rations. However, wine was often considered too valuable to use as a daily water substitute, instead being reserved for special occasions, medical purposes, or use as a trade commodity. A barrel of good wine could be worth its weight in silver when traded with the right buyer, making it more valuable as currency than as a beverage for many pirate crews. The constant consumption of alcohol instead of water created its own significant set of problems that pirates had to navigate carefully. Chronic dehydration was a constant companion for sailors, who relied primarily on alcoholic beverages for hydration, as alcohol actually removes water from the body, even while providing liquid. This created a dangerous cycle where sailors would drink more alcohol to quench their thirst, only to become more dehydrated and more desperate for liquid relief. The long-term health effects of this alcohol-heavy diet were severe and far-reaching. Liver damage was virtually universal among long-term sailors, with many developing what would now be recognized as alcoholic liver disease long before middle age. Malnutrition was exacerbated by alcohol consumption, as the empty calories from alcohol could suppress appetite, while providing no essential nutrients. Behavioral problems associated with constant alcohol consumption could make life aboard ship even more dangerous than it already was. Crew members under the influence of alcohol were more likely to fall overboard, make critical navigation errors, or engage in fights that could escalate into deadly conflicts. Some crews would descend into chaos when alcohol supplies ran high, while others would face mutiny and despair when alcohol ran low. Experienced pirate captains learned to manage their crews' alcohol consumption with the same careful attention they paid to navigation or combat tactics. Some would designate certain crew members to remain relatively sober at all times, ensuring that the ship could still be operated safely, even when the majority of the crew was intoxicated. Others would carefully ration alcohol to prevent both dangerous overconsumption and the despair that came with running out of supplies entirely. The search for safe drinking water and alcohol became one of the primary motivations driving pirate activities throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Raids on coastal settlements were often undertaken primarily to acquire freshwater supplies and alcohol rather than treasure or other valuable goods. A town with a freshwater spring or a warehouse full of rum barrels might be more attractive to a desperate pirate crew than a settlement rumored to contain gold. Islands with reliable freshwater sources became strategic prizes that pirates would fight to control, not just for their immediate water needs, but for the long-term advantage they provided. Knowledge of hidden springs, reliable wells, or other sources of fresh water was closely guarded information that could mean the difference between life and death for an entire crew. The relationship between pirates and alcohol also influenced their interactions with legitimate merchants and colonial authorities. Pirates with good reputations for payment might be able to purchase high-quality alcohol and water supplies from merchants willing to trade with them, while crews known for violence or cheating would be forced to rely on theft and raids to obtain necessary liquid supplies. While hardtack, salt meat, and alcohol formed the foundation of the pirate diet, these basic provisions were barely sufficient to keep a crew alive. let alone healthy or combative. Effective. The monotonous and nutritionally deficient nature of these staples led to a host of health problems that plagued every pirate crew, creating invisible enemies that were often more dangerous than any naval patrol or rival pirate band. Understanding these health challenges requires us to look beyond the romanticized image of hardy seafaring adventurers and confront the brutal reality of men whose bodies were slowly destroying themselves from the inside out. These weren't minor inconveniences or temporary discomforts. They were serious medical conditions that killed more pirates than all the battles, storms, and hangings combined. The most feared enemy of every sailor, pirate or otherwise, was scurvy, a disease so devastating that it killed more seafaring men than all other causes combined. Modern medicine understands that scurvy results from severe vitamin C deficiency, but to pirates of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a mysterious and terrifying killer that could transform healthy men into walking corpses within weeks. Vitamin C is essential for the production of collagen, the protein that holds human tissue together. Without adequate vitamin C, the human body literally begins to fall apart at the cellular level, starting with the most vulnerable tissues and progressing inexorably toward total system failure. Pirates, subsisting on a diet completely devoid of fresh fruits and vegetables, were particularly vulnerable to this devastating condition. The early symptoms of scurvy were subtle enough that they could easily be attributed to the normal hardships of life at sea. Fatigue, joint pain, and general weakness were common complaints among sailors, regardless of their health status, making it difficult to identify scurvy cases before they progressed to more serious stages. This delayed recognition meant that by the time scurvy was obvious, it was often too late for effective treatment. As vitamin C deficiency progressed, the symptoms became impossible to ignore and increasingly horrifying to witness. The victim's gums would begin to swell, becoming soft, spongy, and prone to bleeding at the slightest touch. The gum tissue would take on a dark purple or black coloration that made eating even soft foods an agonizing experience. The breath of scurvy victims became notoriously foul, a combination of infection, decay, and something indefinably wrong that could clear a room. The dental manifestations of scurvy were particularly disturbing for both victims and their shipmates. Teeth would begin to loosen in their sockets, not from decay, but because the gums literally lost their ability to hold them in place. Sailors would wake up to find their teeth loose in their mouths, or discover them scattered around their sleeping areas like gruesome confetti. The pain associated with loose teeth made eating their already difficult diet nearly impossible, creating a vicious cycle where victims couldn't consume the few nutrients available to them. The skin manifestations of scurvy created a visual horror that haunted the memories of survivors long after their voyages ended. Old wounds would spontaneously reopen, refusing to heal despite treatment and care. New cuts and bruises would appear to heal normally at first, only to break open again weeks or months later, as if the body had forgotten how to repair itself. The skin would develop a characteristic pallor that made victims look corpse-like, even while they remained conscious and alert. Small blood vessels would rupture randomly, creating purple and red patches across the body that looked like massive bruises, but felt tender to the touch. Hair would become brittle and fall out in clumps, and fingernails would develop dark lines and become prone to breaking and infection. In the advanced stages of scurvy, victims would develop severe anemia that made even the simplest tasks exhausting. Walking across the deck might leave a sailor gasping for breath, while climbing the rigging became impossible. Internal bleeding would cause severe abdominal pain and produce black, tarry stools that signaled potentially fatal hemorrhaging in the digestive system. The immune system would collapse completely, leaving scurvy victims vulnerable to other infections that their bodies could no longer fight off. Simple cuts would become infected and refuse to heal, while respiratory infections could quickly progress to pneumonia or other life-threatening complications. The combination of scurvy with other diseases created a cascade of medical problems that overwhelmed the limited medical knowledge available to pirate crews. Death from scurvy was often slow and agonizing, with victims remaining conscious and aware as their bodies literally fell apart around them. The psychological impact of watching shipmates slowly deteriorate and die from this mysterious disease created an atmosphere of dread and hopelessness that could destroy crew morale faster than any enemy attack. What made scurvy particularly terrifying for pirates was its unpredictable timeline and the way it could affect an entire crew simultaneously. Some men might show symptoms after just a few weeks at sea, while others could go months before developing the disease. This variability was likely due to differences in individual vitamin C stores, previous dietary habits, and genetic factors. But to pirates of the era, it seemed random and supernatural. The social dynamics aboard ships affected by scurvy were complex and often tragic. Some crews would abandon sick members at the first opportunity, viewing them as burdens that threatened the survival of healthy sailors. Others would stubbornly care for their afflicted mates, even as resources dwindled and their own health deteriorated, creating touching examples of loyalty and brotherhood in the face of impossible circumstances. Experienced pirate captains learned to recognize the early warning signs of scurvy, and would go to extraordinary lengths to find sources of fresh food that might prevent or treat the disease. However, their understanding of the condition was limited and often completely incorrect, leading to treatments that were ineffective at best and sometimes actually harmful. Some pirates believed that scurvy was caused by bad air or poor hygiene, leading them to focus on cleaning the ship and improving ventilation rather than addressing the real nutritional deficiency. Others thought that the disease was caused by laziness or moral weakness, leading to cruel treatment of victims who were already suffering from a devastating medical condition. The few pirates who made connections between fresh food and scurvy recovery were often dismissed as superstitious or unscientific by their peers. The idea that a simple dietary change could prevent such a terrible disease seemed too simple to be true, leading many crews to continue suffering from scurvy even when prevention was theoretically possible. Beyond scurvy, pirates faced numerous other health challenges directly related to their inadequate and contaminated diets. Malnutrition was endemic among pirate crews, with most sailors existing in a state of chronic hunger, even when food supplies were technically adequate. The lack of dietary variety meant that crews were often deficient in multiple vitamins and minerals simultaneously, creating a complex web of health problems that weakened them both individually and collectively. Digestive problems were constant companions for pirates, forced to consume spoiled and contaminated food on a daily basis. Diarrhea and stomach cramps were so common that they were considered normal parts of life at sea, with sailors developing tolerance for levels of discomfort that would incapacitate most modern people. More serious conditions, like dysentery, could spread rapidly through a confined crew, causing severe dehydration and potentially fatal complications. The high salt content of the pirate diet created additional health challenges that compounded their existing problems. Kidney stones were common among long-term sailors, caused by the combination of chronic dehydration and excessive sodium intake. High blood pressure, though not understood at the time, likely contributed to strokes and heart problems among pirates who lived long enough to experience these conditions. Food poisoning was another constant threat that pirates faced with every meal. Without reliable methods for determining whether preserved foods had spoiled beyond smell and visual inspection, pirates regularly consumed foods that were contaminated with dangerous bacteria. Botulism, salmonella, and other bacterial infections could strike without warning, sometimes affecting multiple crew members simultaneously and leaving ships dangerously undermanned. The psychological effects of constantly consuming disgusting, barely edible food took their own toll on pirate crews. Many developed eating disorders, either refusing to eat until they were literally starving or becoming obsessed with food and consuming anything edible whenever it became available. The constant stress of never knowing when the next decent meal might come contributed to the mental instability that many pirates exhibited, affecting their judgment and decision-making abilities in potentially fatal ways. Dental problems were universal among pirates, caused partly by scurvy, but also by the abrasive nature of their diet and the complete absence of any form of dental care. Constantly chewing on hardtack and tough salt meat wore down teeth and caused numerous fractures and breaks. The high sugar content of rum, combined with poor oral hygiene and vitamin deficiencies, created perfect conditions for tooth decay and gum disease that could progress to life-threatening infections. Many pirates would lose most of their teeth before reaching middle age, making it even more difficult to consume their already challenging diet. Toothless pirates would have to rely on soaking their food for extended periods or finding crew members willing to pre-chew their rations, adding another layer of indignity to an already difficult existence. The cumulative effect of these health problems was a population of men who were often operating at a fraction of their physical and mental potential. Chronic malnutrition meant that pirates were more susceptible to injuries and took much longer to heal from. Wounds that might be minor inconveniences for well-nourished individuals. Their weakened immune systems made them vulnerable to diseases that might not affect people with adequate nutrition. This created a dangerous downward spiral where poor health made it harder to obtain better food through successful raids or trading, while poor food made their health progressively worse. Crews that couldn't maintain their health eventually became unable to function as effective pirates, leading to capture, starvation, or dissolution of the crew as members sought better opportunities elsewhere. The health challenges faced by pirates also affected their relationships with potential recruits and allies. Men who had other options were often reluctant to join crews that were visibly suffering from malnutrition and disease, while healthy crews could attract better recruits and form more effective partnerships with other pirate bands. Given the dire state of their standard provisions and the devastating health consequences of their basic diet, pirates became incredibly resourceful and often desperately violent in their efforts to supplement their meager rations. These supplementary food sources weren't luxury items or culinary experiments. They were literal lifelines that could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire crew. Understanding these supplementary sources helps explain many aspects of pirate behavior that might otherwise seem purely motivated by greed or random violence. The search for fresh food was often just as important as the quest for treasure, and sometimes more urgent than any other consideration facing a pirate crew. Raiding other ships represented the most direct and immediate way for pirates to improve their dire nutritional situation. And food supplies were frequently more valuable than gold or silver to crews that hadn't eaten a decent meal in months. The sight of a merchant vessel's smoke on the horizon didn't just represent the possibility of treasure. It represented hope for survival itself. the chance to raid fresh provisions that could transform a dying crew into an effective fighting force. Merchant vessels carrying livestock were the ultimate prize for hungry pirates, offering the tantalizing possibility of fresh meat for the first time in what might have been months of subsisting on leather-tough salt pork and maggot-infested hardtack. A single ship carrying cattle, pigs, or chickens was like discovering a floating restaurant to men whose mouths had forgotten the taste of food that didn't require hammering before consumption. The process of capturing and utilizing livestock from raided ships was both an art and a desperate scramble against time. Pirates had to balance the immediate need for fresh meat against the practical challenges of keeping animals alive on ships that were undesigned for livestock transport. Most captured animals had to be slaughtered quickly, before the stress of capture and the unsuitable conditions aboard pirate ships could kill them or make their meat inedible. When pirates successfully captured a vessel with live animals, the result was often an immediate feast of almost religious significance to men who had been starving on preserved rations. Fresh beef or pork, even if hastily prepared over crude fires on deck, represented a luxury beyond imagination. The psychological impact of a single meal of fresh meat could transform crew morale dramatically, turning a demoralized group of sick men into an energetic and cohesive fighting force ready to take on any challenge. However, the celebration was always temporary. Without proper facilities for preservation, most fresh meat would spoil within days in tropical heat, forcing crews to consume enormous quantities quickly or watch their prize rot before their eyes. Pirates developed techniques for preserving captured fresh meat through smoking, salting, or drying. But these improvised methods were often inconsistent and required knowledge that not all crew members possessed. The slaughter and preparation of captured livestock became elaborate rituals that brought crews together in ways that few other activities could match. Men who had been barely speaking to each other due to the stress and desperation of their circumstances would work together to butcher animals, tend cooking fires, and share in the preparation of their feast. These moments of cooperation and shared purpose helped maintain the social bonds that kept pirate crews functional despite the terrible conditions they endured. Merchant ships carrying other types of fresh provisions were almost as valuable as those with livestock. Vessels bound for colonial settlements often carried barrels of recently preserved meat that hadn't yet developed the rock-hard consistency of long-stored salt pork. They might have wheels of cheese that hadn't yet molded, sacks of flour that weren't completely infested with insects, or barrels of pickled vegetables that represented the closest thing to fresh produce that pirates might see for months. Some of the most valuable captures were ships carrying luxury food items that could transform the pirate diet from mere survival rations into something approaching actual cuisine. Spices, sugar, dried fruits, nuts, and preserved delicacies could add flavor and variety to otherwise monotonous meals, while providing essential nutrients that were completely absent from standard pirate fare. The distribution of captured food supplies often tested the democratic principles that many pirate crews claimed to follow. When food was scarce, sharing captured provisions equally was relatively straightforward. But when a crew suddenly found themselves with an abundance of fresh food, decisions about distribution became more complex. Should everyone receive equal shares, or should sick crew members receive larger portions to help them recover? Should the captain and officers receive better cuts of meat, or should all food be distributed democratically? These questions could lead to serious conflicts that threatened crew unity and sometimes resulted in violence or mutiny. Smart pirate captains learned to establish clear rules about food distribution before successful raids. preventing disputes that could destroy crew cohesion just when they needed it most. Fishing represented another crucial supplement to the pirate diet. Though it required skills, equipment, and favorable conditions that weren't always available to pirate crews, the ocean surrounding their ships teemed with potential protein sources, but catching fish from a moving vessel required techniques and knowledge that many pirates didn't possess when they first took to the seas. Pirates used various methods to catch fish, ranging from simple hooks and lines to more elaborate nets and traps. Some crews included members with fishing experience from their previous lives, men who could teach their shipmates the techniques needed to successfully catch fish in deep ocean waters. These skilled fishermen often became valuable crew members regardless of their fighting abilities, as their knowledge could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation. The types of fish available varied dramatically depending on the pirate's location and the season, requiring crews to adapt their techniques and expectations based on where their voyages took them. In the warm waters of the Caribbean, pirates might catch dolphins, tuna, flying fish, and various tropical species that provided both immediate sustenance and the possibility of preservation for future meals. Flying fish were particularly prized by Caribbean pirates, not just for their nutritional value, but because they could sometimes be caught without any equipment at all. These fish would occasionally land on deck after being startled by the ship's passage, providing unexpected protein supplements that felt like gifts from the sea itself. Some crews became skilled at encouraging flying fish to land on their vessels, using lights and other techniques to attract the fish during their nighttime flights. Dolphins represented one of the most valuable fish catchers available to pirates, providing large amounts of meat that could feed an entire crew for several days. However, catching dolphins required skill, proper equipment, and considerable luck, as these intelligent mammals were often wary of ships and difficult to approach close enough for successful fishing. Tuna and other large fish provided similar benefits to dolphins, but were often easier to catch using conventional fishing techniques. A single large tuna could provide dozens of meals for a hungry crew, and the meat could be preserved through salting, smoking, or drying for future consumption. Some pirate crews became skilled at processing large fish catches, developing techniques for maximizing the nutritional value and preservation potential of their catches. In Atlantic waters, pirates encountered different species that required different techniques and offered different nutritional benefits. Cod, mackerel, and herring were common catches that provided good protein sources, though they were often smaller than the tropical fish found in Caribbean waters. Some of these fish were better suited to immediate consumption, while others could be preserved more effectively for long-term storage. The challenge with fishing from pirate ships was that it required the vessel to either stop or move very slowly, making the crew vulnerable to pursuit by naval forces or attack by rival pirates. Many fishing expeditions had to be cut short when lookouts spotted other ships on the horizon, forcing crews to choose between the immediate need for food and the longer-term need for safety and freedom. Some pirate crews developed techniques for fishing while under sail, using trailing lines and lures that could catch fish even while the ship maintained speed. These methods were less effective than stationary fishing, but allowed crews to supplement their diet without compromising their security or mobility. One of the most prized catches available to pirates was turtle, particularly the large sea turtles found throughout Caribbean waters. These ancient reptiles represented a perfect food source for hungry pirates. They were large enough to feed an entire crew, their meat was delicious and nutritious, and they could be kept alive on deck for extended periods, providing fresh meat on demand. Turtle hunting required specific knowledge and techniques that not all pirate crews possessed, but those who mastered the art found themselves with a significant advantage over their competitors. Adult sea turtles could weigh hundreds of pounds and provide meat for weeks, while their eggs represented an additional source of protein that could be eaten fresh or preserved for future consumption. The shells of captured turtles weren't wasted. They could be fashioned into bowls, containers, and other useful items that improved life aboard ship. Some pirates became skilled at working with turtle shell, creating decorative and functional items that could be traded or kept as personal possessions. However, turtle hunting was seasonal and location dependent, requiring crews to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of these opportunities. Nesting seasons provided the best chances for turtle hunting, but they also attracted other predators and competitors who might challenge pirates for access to these valuable food sources. Seabirds represented another potential protein source that was available to pirates throughout their voyages, though catching them required different skills and techniques than fishing or turtle hunting. Pirates learned to catch birds that landed on their ships, particularly during long ocean crossings when exhausted birds might rest on the rigging or deck. Some crews became skilled at using nets, snares, or improvised traps to catch birds that came within range of their ships. Others developed techniques for attracting birds using bait or lures, though this required resources that might be better used for other purposes. The nutritional value of seabirds varied considerably depending on the species and the time of year, with some birds providing excellent protein, while others were barely worth the effort required to catch and prepare them. Seabird eggs, when available, were considered delicacies that provided both nutrition and variety to the monotonous pirate diet. When pirates had opportunities to make landfall, either at friendly ports or uninhabited islands, they could potentially supplement their diet with wild game and foraged foods that represented a dramatic improvement over their ship's provisions. However, these opportunities came with significant risks and challenges that had to be carefully weighed against the potential benefits. Hunting required firearms and ammunition that pirates might prefer to save for combat situations, creating a tension between immediate nutritional needs and long-term survival requirements. Gunpowder was precious and expensive, and using it to hunt wild game meant having less available for fighting other ships or defending against attacks. Despite these concerns, the payoff from successful hunting expeditions could be substantial enough to justify the risks and expense. Wild pigs, goats, deer, birds, and other animals could provide fresh meat that was far superior to anything pirates could obtain at sea, while the psychological benefits of eating truly fresh food could transform crew morale and effectiveness. Some Caribbean islands had populations of feral pigs and goats that had been introduced by earlier European colonizers and had multiplied rapidly in the absence of natural predators. These animals represented ideal hunting targets for pirates, as they were numerous, relatively easy to catch, and provided excellent meat that could feed large crews. Hunting expeditions also provided opportunities for crew members to work together in ways that strengthened social bonds and improved cooperation. Men who might have been at odds over other issues could find common ground while tracking game or preparing their kills, creating shared experiences that helped maintain crew unity. Foraging for wild plants, fruits, and nuts required knowledge that few pirates possessed, as most came from urban backgrounds with little experience in wilderness survival. However, some crews included members with farming, hunting, or indigenous knowledge who could identify edible plants and guide foraging expeditions safely and effectively. Coconuts were among the most valuable foraged foods available to pirates operating in tropical waters, providing both nutritious meat and refreshing liquid that could help address dehydration issues. A single coconut palm could provide dozens of coconuts, and the trees were common throughout the Caribbean and other tropical regions where pirates operated. Tropical fruits like mangoes, papayas, and various berries could provide essential vitamins that were completely absent from the standard pirate diet, potentially preventing or treating scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases. However, identifying safe fruits required knowledge that could be dangerous to acquire through trial and error. Wild nuts, when available, provided concentrated nutrition and could often be stored for future consumption, making them particularly valuable to pirate crews planning extended voyages. Some nuts could be processed into oils or pastes that added variety and nutrition to otherwise monotonous meals. The challenge with foraging expeditions was that they required time and knowledge that pirate crews often lacked. Most foraging had to be completed quickly, within hours rather than days, to avoid detection by naval patrols or rival pirates. This time pressure limited the effectiveness of foraging, but could still provide valuable supplements to crew nutrition. Trading with local populations offered another avenue for obtaining fresh food, though this required pirates to find populations that were either sympathetic to their cause or desperate enough to trade with known criminals. These trading relationships were complex and often dangerous, requiring careful negotiation and constant vigilance. Some Caribbean islands had populations that were sympathetic to pirates, either because they benefited economically from pirate activities, or because they had grievances against colonial authorities. These communities might be willing to trade fresh fruits, vegetables, grains, and locally produced foods in exchange for money, goods, or protection. Other communities might trade with pirates purely out of economic necessity, despite disapproving of their activities. Pirates often had access to goods and money that were scarce in colonial settlements, making them attractive trading partners despite the risks involved. However, trading relationships also carried significant dangers for pirate crews. They had to reveal their locations and intentions to potentially hostile populations, making themselves vulnerable to betrayal or attack. They also had to part with valuable treasure, goods, or weapons in exchange for food. Reducing their resources for other necessities, some unscrupulous traders would take advantage of desperate pirates, charging exorbitant prices for basic foodstuffs or providing inferior goods that might be spoiled or contaminated. Pirates who were starving or desperate might accept these unfavorable trades, only to discover that their expensive food purchases were barely edible. Despite these risks, successful trading relationships could provide access to fresh foods that were impossible to obtain through raiding or foraging. Local populations often had access to fruits, vegetables, grains, and prepared foods that could dramatically improve pirate nutrition and health. The most successful pirate crews were those that could effectively balance all these supplementary food sources, while managing the risks and challenges associated with each method. They needed the military skills to successfully capture merchant vessels and take their provisions, the seamanship and fishing knowledge to supplement their diet from the sea, the hunting and foraging skills to take advantage of opportunities on land, and the diplomatic abilities to establish beneficial trading relationships with coastal populations. Understanding the pirate diet also provides valuable insight into the broader social and economic conditions of their historical era, revealing the limited opportunities and brutal working conditions that drove men to choose such a dangerous and difficult lifestyle. The fact that men would voluntarily choose the pirate life, despite its obvious hardships and terrible food, speaks to the desperate poverty and poor working conditions that characterized the lives of common sailors and laborers in the 17th and 18th centuries. In many cases, the terrible food aboard pirate ships was still superior to what these men had experienced in their previous lives as merchant sailors, naval-pressed men, or urban laborers. This highlights the desperate poverty and exploitation that characterized the lives of working-class men during this period, making piracy appear attractive despite its obvious dangers and deprivations. The technological limitations of the era meant that food preservation was a constant challenge for all seafaring vessels, not just pirate ships. However, pirates faced additional difficulties because they couldn't rely on regular resupply from friendly ports, couldn't afford to purchase the highest quality provisions, and often had to make do with whatever they could steal, scavenge, or acquire through questionable means. This forced them to become experts in survival, eating, developing techniques and tolerances that would be remarkable by any standard. Their ability to extract nutrition from spoiled food, to identify the least contaminated portions of rotting provisions, and to maintain their health on diets that would kill most people demonstrates both the extremity of their circumstances and their remarkable adaptability. The communal nature of eating aboard pirate ships created bonds between crew members that went far beyond mere professional association or shared criminal enterprise. Men who had shared wormy hardtack and rancid salt meat, who had watched each other struggle to consume inedible provisions, and who had pooled their resources to obtain fresh food, developed a camaraderie based on mutual suffering and shared survival that could be incredibly strong and enduring. These bonds, forged in the crucible of shared nutritional deprivation, created loyalty that could survive even the most extreme hardships and disagreements. The sharing of food, particularly when fresh provisions became available, became a ritual that reinforced crew unity, democratic decision-making, and the communal values that many pirate crews claimed to embrace. The contrast between pirate dietary reality and popular mythology serves as a broader reminder about the dangers of romanticizing historical periods without understanding their actual conditions and challenges. The pirate diet represents just one aspect of a lifestyle that was brutally harsh, dangerous, and often, tragically short-lived. Yet it is an aspect that reveals fundamental truths about the human cost of the freedom and adventure that these men sought. While pirates certainly experienced freedom from conventional social constraints and the excitement of life outside society's rules, this freedom came at an enormous cost in terms of health, comfort, and quality of life. Every aspect of their daily existence, from the food they ate to the water they drank, was shaped by the harsh realities of their chosen lifestyle and the limitations of their historical era. The story of pirate food is ultimately a story of human adaptation, innovation, and survival under extreme conditions that few modern people could imagine enduring. Despite facing chronic malnutrition, constant hunger, and the daily challenge of consuming barely edible provisions, pirates found ways not just to survive, but occasionally to thrive in their chosen environment. Their resourcefulness in finding supplementary food sources, their innovation in food preparation and preservation techniques, and their ability to maintain crew cohesion and effectiveness despite terrible nutritional conditions all demonstrate remarkable human resilience and adaptability in the face of seemingly impossible adversity. As we conclude this exploration of the pirate diet, it's worth reflecting on how our modern understanding of nutrition, food safety, and medical science makes their achievements even more remarkable. Without knowing about vitamins, bacteria, proper food handling techniques, or the connections between diet and health, pirates somehow managed to survive and operate effectively on diets that would hospitalize most contemporary people within days. Their tolerance for spoiled food, contaminated water, and monotonous nutrition was developed through necessity and maintained through sheer willpower and the complete absence of alternatives. They had no choice but to adapt or die. And the fact that so many managed to adapt successfully speaks to extraordinary human resilience and the powerful drive to survive even under the most challenging circumstances. The next time you encounter a movie, book, or television show depicting pirates enjoying lavish feasts in tropical taverns, remember the reality behind the romance. Those weathered sailors gnawing on hardtack and washing it down with grog weren't participating in a celebration. They were engaging in a daily struggle for survival that tested every aspect of their physical and psychological endurance. Their diet wasn't a choice but a necessity imposed by the harsh realities of life outside society's protection on the unforgiving seas. Every meal was a reminder of the price they paid for their freedom. Every bite a testament to their determination to survive in a world that offered them few alternatives and fewer comforts. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the pirate diet is what it reveals about the true cost of the freedom and adventure that these men sought. Every piece of moldy hardtack, every strip of leather-tough salt meat, every sip of contaminated water represented a price paid for the privilege of living outside society's rules and constraints. The question that haunts any honest examination of pirate life is whether the freedom was worth the cost. For the men who chose and continued to choose the pirate lifestyle despite its obvious hardships, the answer was apparently yes, even though many paid the ultimate price for that choice through shortened lives, chronic illness, and early death. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that every lifestyle, every choice, and every form of freedom comes with trade-offs and costs that must be honestly acknowledged and carefully weighed. The romantic appeal of any historical period or lifestyle must be balanced against the harsh realities that people actually faced, the genuine hardships they endured, and the true price they paid for their choices. The pirate diet, in all its disgusting, unpalatable detail, provides a window into one of history's most mythologized lifestyles, revealing the gritty truth behind the swashbuckling legend. In understanding what pirates actually ate, how they obtained their food, and what they sacrificed for their dietary choices, we come to understand something fundamental about who they really were. They weren't the romantic heroes of popular culture, sailing the seas in search of adventure and treasure, while enjoying endless feasts and celebrations. They were desperate men making the best of impossible circumstances, surviving on provisions that would challenge the strongest stomachs and the most determined wills, paying a daily price in hunger, illness, and deprivation for the freedom they had chosen. In the end, the pirate diet tells us as much about human nature, resilience, and the will to survive as it does about historical food practices. It reminds us that behind every legend lies a human reality, and that the true measure of these men wasn't their treasure or their exploits, but their ability to survive and maintain their humanity, while living one terrible meal at a time.